All right, so this first video, I thought it was a really useful one, even though it's older. Obviously this one was actually filmed in the 1980s. There was a PBS special, like mini series called The Brain. And some of the things that they reported in the 1980s, we've got better understanding, or even some of them we realize now a different understanding. This is a good example, though, of how you have this former lawyer who, since his stroke, is having a lot of difficulty with the ambiguous sentence structure. Actually, what he was having trouble with is when they matched, when the surface structures were synonymous, he couldn't understand that those were equivalent anymore, right? So he made mistakes when the surface structure was different, but the meaning stayed the same. He had a lot of difficulty with that. And so that's a good example of how there are biological factors underlying, these kinds of language behaviors. Now on this video, let me get going here. Oh no, let me get to that after I introduce Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky was the he's the psycholinguist I talked about at the very beginning of class, that he helped to overturn behaviorism's hold on psychology and really helped to usher in the cognitive revolution. He is still alive today. He has long retired from research and stuff, but he has gotten very politically active. So you might have all along been thinking, gosh, that name sounds familiar. Why would I know Noam Chomsky? You might know him because he's politically active. But he introduced the concept of universal grammar. He suggested that you don't learn language through reinforcements and so on. You learn language through just purely exposure to language, and that you were born with this universal grammar in your head. Now, it's really important to clarify that he didn't mean that you were born with a language in your head. He meant that you were born primed to notice the regularities in a language, to notice the correct ordering of the words, when to use prepositions or not. Those kinds of nuts and bolts, you were primed to observe the semantics and the syntax of the language and to apply them on the fly. Not that we're saying that little babies are saying, oh, I see I was born into one of these languages where the correct structure is, noun, verb, object. I must apply these rules. Certainly no baby is thinking that, but they're noticing how the adults around them or the older kids around them are speaking, and they internalize those rules. And I was watching some videos the other day that really drove home for me that probably what you experience in your very early years sets up your grammar system to function the way that your grammar system functions. So I'll give you an example. The word see, right? The past tense of see is saw, right? I saw a dog running down the street. But there is a substantial subset of English speakers who say, I seen a dog running down the street. They probably picked up that structure when they were really young. They probably did not hear it once they went to school, except for maybe from their peers. But from the moment we were like deliberately focusing on language teaching, it's probably too late. It's probably their universal grammar system when they were between birth and probably 4 years old had collected all the information that it needed to know that the correct structure is to use the word saw or to use the word seen. That, different people had different exposures to that structure. My dad is one who used seen when he should have used saw. And my mom doesn't do that. And I think it has to do with where they were raised, right? They had different upbringings in different regions of the country. And I think it has to do with that, sort of climate of the different places where they were raised. It doesn't mean one of them is smarter than the other. It means nothing like that. It means that this is probably what they were exposed to when they were very young, and their universal grammar system was looking for the regularities in the language, how the people around them spoke. So probably My grandparents who raised my dad probably said seen, whereas my grandparents who raised my mom probably said saw, right? Like that's probably where this stuff comes from. So the universal grammar system, according to Chomsky, is the reason why babies and toddlers are able to start figuring out how to make their own utterances. They learn very early on that language is systematic and language is creative, that there are rules that are governing this language, and that as long as you stick with the rules, there is this infinite capability to produce anything you want within the rules. You watched the video with Steven Pinker where he talked about how you could do, he designed a study where you could tell the child, this is a toma. Now I have two. What do I have two of? And the child will say two tomas. The child knows that there's a rule where if you're going to pluralize it, you just put an S on the end of it. They don't think to themselves, I must put an S. They just do it. It's natural. It's how language works, right? If you want to say that something is the best, you put an EST on the end of it. So you say, that's the funniest. That's the fastest. That's the cutest. The way that we know that people do that is from either teaching them a word that doesn't really exist or by watching the mistakes that little kids make. So you've probably heard little kids say bestest or mostest, right? This is them applying the rule on the fly because it's the easiest thing to do once you get a big enough vocabulary. And sometimes it's a mistake. Sometimes the fastest thing in the rule application is not correct because there are exceptions in every language. So the fact that kids naturally make mistakes, and they're very predictable mistakes, is one piece of evidence that they recognize that language is rule governed and that there is this universal grammar system in their head that is looking for those rules. And then the other way that we notice through the kinds of experiments that Steven Pinker showed, where you can teach them toma or you can teach them chan, and they know to say that they channed as the past tense, right? So these kinds of experiments and these kinds of observations in real life is what led Chomsky to say, I think we're born with a universal grammar system. So one of the things that he argued is that having these rules that apply to our language actually makes it easier to use the language. All of us who have learned a second language, I started learning Spanish when I was probably 13 years old. So, I was well outside of the universal grammar stage. And as I was learning Spanish and learning about conjugation and all these things that I didn't know from English, because English is my first language and so I just speak it, I said to my Spanish teacher, you can laugh at me if you want to, it's okay. I said to my Spanish teacher, why does Spanish have all these rules for conjugation? Why don't they just have different words for everything like we do in English? And the teacher goes, we don't have different words for everything. What are you talking about? And I'm like, well, we just say go or going or went. Or and she's like, we have a root word called to go and you just conjugated it. And I was like, whoa, blow my mind. You just blew my mind, Spanish teacher. I never knew I was conjugating on the fly. I think that might have been when my language interest was born. Wait, what? I've been conjugating and I don't even know that? You've got to be kidding me. So I'm going to argue that, yeah, it is easier when you have rules because you don't even know you're applying the rules. But I'm going to get you guys to do a little example in your head. I know we're not together, so I'll just have you think about it. If I gave you this string of numbers and told you to remember it, we all know that you're probably not going to remember them all because we've already studied memory span and we know that is way outside your memory span. So you probably can't get them all. So don't even try. You're probably not going to get those. What if I told you this is the string of numbers that you need to remember? Well, this is technically within the magic number 7, right? Plus or minus 7. So it's probably possible. But if you look at the numbers, you might start to notice there's actually a pattern to them. These are actually the same numbers as above. I just recombined them. So now we've got 3, 9, 27, 81. Now, these next ones might not cue you unless you've done a lot of math and you've calculated things out and you know your bigger numbers. But those first four, I'll bet you're recognizing, they seem to have some things in common, don't they? What if you noticed, whoops, there it is. All I have to do is multiply the current number by 3 and I'll get the next number. Oh, okay, so 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times 9 is 27. 27 times 3 is 81. We will trust me when I say that 3 times 81 is 243, and so on. If I can just remember the rule, start with 3 and multiply by 3 to create the next number, you could go on forever, right? To apply that, there's no need to remember any of these numbers except for the number 3 and the fact that you're going to multiply by 3. And now you could go on forever and you could generate all sorts of numbers as a function of applying that rule. It takes a lot of your mental load off. You don't have to remember anything except for start with 3 and multiply by 3. That's not a lot to remember. That is certainly within your memory span, as opposed to trying to remember 7 individual numbers that get increasingly large, right? Like that'd be hard to remember. Think about it like that with language. If you have rules that you can apply, it's going to take a lot of your mental load off. You're not going to have to think. And that's one of the problems with being a second language learner who starts in their teen years or later, is that you don't get the benefit of this easy application of the rules. You may recognize that there's a rule, but it's done effortfully as you're trying. The more you practice, the less effortful it is. But anybody who's listening to me who has English as their second language and is trying to listen to what I'm saying and trying to understand the regularities, given that their original language probably doesn't have these same grammar rules, it's hard. It's very mentally taxing. It's such a relief if you can find someone else who can speak your language and you can relax for a second, not have to be, like translating everything all the time. Having rules on your native language, and those rules can be applied on the fly without much effort, that is a beautiful thing, right? It makes the whole thing possible. All right, I've got another couple of videos to queue up for you. Again, this is how we find out how babies start to home in on recognizing the phonemes of the language that they've been exposed to and start losing their ability to hear the phonemes of another language. So that's a really good video for you to watch. Oh, here's the Steven Pinker one. So I gave you a little bit of a preview, but you're going to see the Steven Pinker in this playlist. So I apologize for making it seem like you should have seen it in the last one. So let's wrap this up though with some animal language. Actually, see, I can correct what I just did by putting that ahead of this. I'll put Steven Pinker ahead. Animal language, I've kind of been alluding to this the whole time, right? That animals do communicate with each other. So what we wonder is whether this capacity for the kind of language that humans have that can displace, talk about things that aren't even here, stuff like that, that has, all the qualities that make it, unique and that is universal to all natural languages. Does that make us fundamentally different from animals who don't have that capability, that don't have the ability to communicate in that kind of language? In some fashion, it has to make us different, right? Like something is different about humans because we can talk to each other the way that we can talk to each other or write to each other. I mean, being able to even displace further and talk via writing, that's pretty special and different, right? So let's talk about, and you're going to see these in your playlist also, let's talk about some animal language issues. Alex the Gray Parrot is in this video, and unfortunately he has subsequently died. He should have lived another like 50 years, but they found him in his cage and they have no idea why he died. In this video, he's molting. That is not why he died. He lived another 10 years after this video. But he has subsequently died very young for him. And it's heartbreaking because it took, not only because he's adorable. When you watch this video, it's just, he's so sweet and has such a sweet personality. But they spent a lot of time teaching him the names of everything and teaching him what the symbols mean. And what the concepts are that they wanted him to learn. So there was a lot of investment into getting him to a place where now we could start to understand what he's thinking and what he knows and what he understands. And he could apply concepts really well. So he helped to really start the conversation about bird cognition being a lot more complex than people had previously thought bird cognition was, based on his ability to use human words to describe things that he might know. So check out that video. That's pretty cool. He's a cool little dude, and he's so adorable. Then there is Kanzi the bonobo. This looks like, okay, don't judge me for knowing this, but this looks like the kinds of things that LSD comes on. They're like little stamps that'll have LSD on them, and they look a lot like this, but that's not what this is. That is not what I'm showing you. These are what are called lexicograms that they taught Kanzi, the bonobo monkey, I think he's a bonobo chimpanzee, how to communicate with. This is a very interesting case because Kanzi was the baby and his mother Muliki was being taught these lexicograms when he was just a brand new born baby. She was a good little mom, took her kid to work, and so she was learning what these lexicograms mean, and was able to get a few of them down. So she learned a couple of things that she could ask for outside. She could ask for an orange, things like that. But she didn't learn very many of these lexicograms, and she never put them together. But meanwhile, here's little baby Kanzi just sort of there while she's being taught. And Kanzi learned really fast. So one of the things that Kanzi illustrated is that, Kanzi and Muliki illustrated, is that there might be a critical period for animals to learn a language. Like you can't take an adult animal of any breed or species and try and teach them a language. It's like us trying to learn a second language. Like it's really hard, and they probably aren't going to get very good at it. So if you want to teach an animal a language, you probably need to start when they're babies. So Kanzi was a really good, example of, sort of brain plasticity, I guess would be a good way to put it, that he was still young enough and flexible enough that he could devote some of his brain, cortex to language. So these little lexicograms all represent something different. So they might represent an object or an activity or a location. And so Kanzi ultimately learned how to put them together into like sentences, and he could communicate what he wanted. He also learned to be receptive to the language really well. So he could learn really complicated, he could hear a really complicated series of instructions and follow them. So it shows that not only could he produce language, but he could produce language in the form of a lexigram, and then he could receive language verbally, like you could say stuff to him and he could understand it. So there's going to be this video, and I just wanted to prime you that she has, the researcher Sue Savage Rumbaugh, she has a welder's mask over her face because she doesn't want to accidentally be like looking at the thing that she wants him to grab or give him some kind of cue other than just the verbal cue. And so apparently this doesn't bother Kanzi. She must do it a lot. It doesn't bother him at all. A lot of people would be, a little bit distracted by somebody talking to them from the other side of a welder's mask, but he must be pretty used to this. And she's able to give him pretty strange and complicated series of sentences, and he's able to display that he understands them. So that'll be the last video in your playlist, and so that should get you through all of those. The last thing I wanted to touch on is the idea of language and thought. And I think most of the time we assume that thought leads to language, right? Like that makes a lot of sense, that you say what you think about. But the Whorfian hypothesis says that, when we speak a language, it causes us to think about things in certain ways. So he called this hypothesis linguistic relativity. He initially thought that it extended to stuff that it turned out that it didn't extend to, but it does apply to a lot of aspects of language, that You literally think differently about the world because of the words that you have available, the grammatical structures that you have available in the language that you predominantly speak. So, for example, one of the ones that Worf established was color. That he showed all sorts of different colors to people in the US and to people in a culture in New Guinea. And he asked them what colors is. And discovered that there were far fewer words for the different kinds of colors in this New Guinean culture than there were in the US culture. And so he came to the conclusion that they maybe weren't even perceiving the colors. That's hard to say. I mean, if I show you two colors that you have the same word for that color, that doesn't mean that you can't see that they're different. Ask a male. If you're not male, ask a male to compare. I'm going to have to give you names of colors because I didn't plan this out. Let's say that you have two shades of red. The person probably can recognize that those are two shades of red, but they may only have the male typically will only have the word red for it. Whereas a female might say something really, believe it or not, they'll say like burgundy or wine or maroon or cardinal or something very specific. They'll have a very specific name for it. And a lot of times males are like, why do you have so many names for that? Isn't red good enough? It turns out that actually females honestly can detect more shades of red, and not even because they have names for it. This research has been done in the U.S. Not even because they have names for it. You can show them two panels and say, are these both one color, or are they two different colors? And based on their responses, females can see more subtle differences between the colors of red to pink. And the hypothesis is that, our ancestral females were the ones who were responsible for picking ripe fruit and things like that. And so they were very sensitive to being able to pick at the right time. I don't know if that's the right explanation or not, because our ancestral females are not here to say anything. But the fact that females can do a better job of seeing that those are two different shades of red than males can on average shows that there is maybe some difference perceptually in the way people are set up. So it's possible that what Worf said is true. That the fact that this culture only has these names for all of these colors implies that maybe they're not really detecting all of the colors. That they're only naming that which they can see, and so they actually perceive the world differently. It's hard to break it down though, because it's hard to know what they can see differently and what they just have names for. And so the Worfian hypothesis with regard to color has been under a lot of scrutiny. Like we're not clear that it's what he said. Now, some other things I thought I'd throw in here that Worf did not discover, but that other people have been, studying cultural differences and language differences in how language depicts itself. Spatial terminology. In some cultures, they use phrases like lift your hand that is to the east or lift your hand that is to the west. Whereas in like the US, we would say lift your left hand or lift your right hand. So you've got these absolute directions, and we would say to you in India, for example, lift the hand that's to the east, when you really are heading, facing north, and I want you to lift your right hand, that would be your east hand. So instead of it being consistent on your body, it's relative to the context, like which way you're facing in this case. Whereas in the US, it's like it sticks with your body. So that is always your left hand. And if I'm facing you and I want you to lift the hand that is on my left, I have to say lift your right hand, right? If I'm facing you and we're mirroring. Whereas if you're in India, we both would, if I'm going to lift my east hand and you're going to lift your east hand, we're going to be mirroring each other. But we didn't have to have that moment of confusion where we're like, my left hand, your right hand, I have to tell you the right one to put up, right? Think how much easier it would be if you were a fitness coach kind of person who faces their class and has to mirror them. You don't have to memorize that it's my left hand, your right hand. You could just say, raise your hand to the east. Seems like it would have some advantages. Now, if you're listening to me, you might be thinking, I never know where east, west, north, south is. This would be more complicated. But if this was important to you, like if this is how you refer to things, you certainly would know where east, west, north, and south is, right? You would have some kind of markers that would help you. You know, the mountains are to the east. Lake Washington is to the west, stuff like that. You would know that because it's relevant, and so you would encode that information. In American culture, it's not as relevant, and so people don't pay attention to that stuff as much. If somebody gives you directions and tells you to drive east for 4 miles, you might be like, okay, step one, where's east? So, it causes you to think about the world differently, right? When you use different ways of communicating this same information. The descriptions of events, use of the active versus passive voice. An active voice might be something like Sam made a mistake, whereas a passive voice might be mistakes were made. A mistake was made, something like that. One of the implications of that is that when there's an accident, if you come from one of the cultures that uses a more passive voice, ultimately you may forget who had even been involved in the accident, let alone who's at fault. Whereas if you tend to be from a culture that uses a more active voice, you're going to remember whose fault it was. And it's probably not a huge surprise that in the US we tend to use that active voice. I dropped the bottle rather than the bottle was dropped. In English, you would say, I dropped the bottle. In Spanish, it translates directly to the bottle was dropped. It's a different way of thinking about it, right? We shouldn't be surprised that here in the US we have, a lot of litigation about, it's your fault I got hurt kind of thing, right? Because we're always looking for who's at fault because we think in that active voice way. And in other cultures, they're very perplexed by that because they're like, well, it was an accident, right? It doesn't matter who did it. It was an accident. It was, it happened. Somebody didn't do it. So you think about the world very differently when you have these different ways of describing events. So linguistic relativity is this whole idea that it's not just that your thoughts drive language, but the way that your language is structured, the way that what words are available to you and things like that impact the way that you think about the world and maybe even perceive the world. All right. So enjoy your playlist, and I will see you next in chapter 11.